At 03:17 a.m. on October 7, 2025, a massive 200-ton Russian military train was slicing through the frozen darkness of the Leningrad Oblast. For the Kremlin, these deep forests, hundreds of miles from the front lines, were considered untouchable territory. This train, managed by Russia's state railway RZD, was the steel spine of Putin's war machine, responsible for moving an estimated 80% of everything needed for the conflict, from Shahed drone parts to critical tank treads. In the eyes of Russian command, this was a fortress of steel and paranoia, wired with seismic sensors and patrolled by Rosgvardia troops every 5 miles. But for Ukraine's intelligence directorate, the HUR, they saw something entirely different. They saw not a fortress, but a fragile chain. And they calculated the rewards for breaking this chain were enormous, paralyzing the critical St. Petersburg-Pskov supply line. The prize starving the Russian front of 500 tons of supplies and emptied every single week. A single perfectly executed break here had the power to fundamentally shift the momentum, creating the difference between a bloody stalemate and a potential 10-mile Ukrainian breakthrough. On paper, the mission was a ghost story. So the core question became, how do you derail a 200-ton train you can't physically reach on a line secured by one of the most paranoid security doctrines in the world? The answer lay in a 3-part operation combining cheap technology, military-grade precision, and exploiting the one element Russia can never fully control: human panic. The operation, which we will call the Kingpin Gambit, began quietly at 21:30 p.m. 2 miles from the target railway, a small team of local partisans moved silently through the birch forest, the crunch of snow barely audible under their boots. They weren't commandos carrying millions in high-tech gear. They were locals carrying a burning grudge against the invaders. Their target wasn't the track itself, which was protected by seismic sensors. It was a simple tree. On it, they mounted a package disguised as a mundane wildlife camera. Inside that innocuous plastic case was the first key to the trap, a $50 commercial jammer. Its circuits had been expertly rewired and tuned to a highly specific frequency, 433 megahertz. Its mission was breathtakingly simple and cheap: to broadcast a single fake stop signal that the approaching train's state-of-the-art safety system would be forced to obey. This is akin to spoofing your GPS to trick a system into thinking you are somewhere you are not. The stakes were enormous. One snapped twig could bring the Rosgvardia patrols crashing down. But the team succeeded, melting back into the darkness, leaving the whole operation resting on a cheap piece of electronics and the predictable arrogance of the Russian security response. At 02:50 a.m., the military train rolled exactly on schedule. As it entered the 2-mile radius of the hidden jammer, the engineer's console erupted. The alarm was loud: relay link failure. Automatically, the emergency brakes slammed on with a deafening screech, bringing the massive train to a dead halt. The Russian security protocol kicked in immediately. A seismic sensor detected the abnormal stop. A patrol drone was dispatched, and within minutes, its thermal camera confirmed the worst fresh tracks in the snow leading away from the railway. This evidence was relayed back to the St. Petersburg Command Center. For a terrifying moment, the operation seemed compromised. But here is where bureaucratic self-preservation won out over actual security. To a well-fed officer 100 miles away from any real danger, sabotage meant weeks of paperwork, uncomfortable internal investigations, and questions from superiors. The alternative: ice damage on the line. This was a simple, no-fault explanation that required minimal fuss to get the system moving again. It was the classic Russian solution: when in doubt, blame the weather. And so the fatal order was given. The military train was ordered to proceed manually. The engineer was told to reduce speed to 35 miles per hour and keep moving. They thought they were being cautious and safe. In reality, they had just committed their 200-ton asset to a predetermined fate, turning their weapon into a slow-moving, perfectly predictable target for the second act. The Russians hadn't just taken the bait, they had helped set the table for their own main course. The moment the engineer pushed the throttle forward, the accelerated train triggered the second invisible phase of the attack. At 03:12 a.m., a Wild Hornet micro-drone emerged from the tree line. This drone was a technological marvel of stealth. Weighing less than half a pound, it didn't fly high. It flew low, hugging the cold steel of the rails like an air hockey puck. This brilliant tactical maneuver ensured its tiny heat signature was lost against the terrain background, making it virtually invisible to thermal cameras. Clutched in its frame was a payload no bigger than a can of beer, a 2-pound shaped charge. This charge was not aimed at the massive engine or the railway ties. It was aimed at something far smaller and infinitely more critical, the steel kingpin on the coupler connecting the 5th and 6th cars. Why the kingpin? Because as the analysis shows, amateurs use big bombs. Professionals break the one link that holds the entire chain together. The kingpin is the single pivot point, the critical screw in the entire 200-ton mechanism. For a second after the hit, everything might look fine, but if you remove that single screw, the entire structure inevitably collapses into a pile of regret. The drone reached its target and the payload connected. The detonation was not a Hollywood fireball. It was a sharp, metallic crack. The explosion was surgically precise, cutting through the thick steel kingpin like a hot knife through butter. The mission was a perfect success, but only for about 12 seconds. 3 miles away, the Russian air defenses finally reacted. The drone's faint motor heat signature was just enough to be spotted by a Panzer S-1 air defense system. Suddenly, a missile costing $200,000 was screaming through the night sky, chasing a drone that cost about the same as a used gaming laptop. At 03:14 a.m., just before the impact window, the micro-drone performed its final suicidal act. It released a burst of chaff, a tiny cloud of aluminum strips that instantly blinded the Panzer's radar. The sophisticated high-speed missile, now blind and unable to lock onto a target, sailed harmlessly into the night. In that same split second, the initial charge detonation achieved its second objective. It generated a fake seismic echo. This small, calculated sound signature, designed to mimic a massive destructive event, instantly sent the paranoid Russian sensors into a frenzy. The system screamed, "Bloody murder!" And instantly, a Rosgvardia quick reaction team was dispatched, their SUVs tearing down the service road with floodlights blazing. The trap was now fully sprung. Up front, the engineer felt a slight jolt, but assumed it was merely the typical slack in the line. Completely unaware that he was now dragging only the first 5 cars, he looked in his mirror and saw the flashing high-beam lights of the approaching Rosgvardia SUVs. He heard the pop of the charge. He saw the lights. He panicked. He thought he was being ambushed. He did the one thing Ukraine's perfectly calculated plan could never have predicted but absolutely depended on. He slammed the throttle and gunned it. This single panicked decision by the engineer was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. That fractured steel coupler, barely holding on by a thread, was suddenly subjected to the immense physical strain of full panicked acceleration. The pressure exerted reached an estimated 200 pounds per square inch psi. The result was immediate, a sound described as a giant's spine snapping. The locomotive lurched violently forward like a dog that had slipped its leash, pulling the first 5 cars away from the rest of the train. In the darkness behind them, the massive remainder, the rest of the 1,000-ton steel serpent, now an unguided battering ram, slammed into itself. This is where the brutal reality of physics took over. The 6th car jackknifed under the immense pressure, and the 7th car, which was loaded to the roof with 152mm artillery shells, plowed directly and violently into the burgeoning pile of wreckage. This was not a mere collision. It was the physical equivalent of a 300-ton steel hammer striking a warehouse filled with unstable dynamite. The immense pressure of the initial impact was all that the percussion primers on those shells needed. The result was an immediate localized chain reaction. The 152mm shells began to cook off, sending sharp, tearing blasts through the convoy. The steel cars were instantly shredded into twisted metal, and a searing white flash momentarily lit up the dark forest. The approaching Rosgvardia team, who had been expecting a confrontation with a few lightly equipped saboteurs, slammed their brakes as they were suddenly met, not with a gunfight, but with an artillery barrage created by the wreckage of their own train. Ukraine did not plant a simple bomb under the tracks. They turned the entire train into a bomb, and then they cleverly tricked the engineer into lighting the fuse. Amidst the initial violent impacts, the screech of 1,000 tons of grinding steel sent a shower of white-hot sparks flying into the night. These sparks found exactly what they were looking for: the ruptured fuel tank of the 8th car. The ignition was not an immediate flashbang. It began with a deep, gut-wrenching whoo, a bloom of orange flame that began to greedily lick at the mangled steel. That initial blaze was not the main event. It was merely the fuse. A fuse that was now burning its way inch by agonizing inch toward car number 9, which was also loaded to the roof with highly volatile 152mm artillery shells. For 2 agonizing minutes, this fire acted as a silent creeping predator feeding on spilled diesel. At 03:17 a.m., the fire reached the shells in Car 9, resulting in the climax, a titanic ground-shattering detonation. A blinding white flash instantly turned the freezing forest into a photo-negative, followed by a concussive roar that was powerful enough to shatter windows 5 miles away. The Rosgvardia troops, who were cautiously approaching the blaze, were literally thrown off their feet by a shockwave that witnesses could easily have mistaken for the fist of God. So how did a simple diesel fuel fire escalate into a military-grade detonation of this magnitude? This is where the science of destruction takes center stage, the phenomenon known as cook-off. The intense extreme heat, likely exceeding 200 degrees Celsius, given similar industrial fires from the burning diesel, did not just warm the artillery shells. It superheated the highly unstable explosive compounds contained inside them. This is fundamentally similar to placing an aerosol can into a bonfire. The pressure builds and accumulates rapidly until the hardened steel casing can no longer withstand it. And here is the critical kicker. The first shell to cook off and explode did not act in isolation. It instantly became the percussion cap, the initiating force for every other shell in that car. Suddenly, you have a massive simultaneous detonation of perhaps 200 tons of ammunition. The energy released is enormous, a massive shockwave that violently warped the steel tracks and toppled birch trees within a 1,000-foot radius. What did the chaos look like on the ground once the massive dust and smoke columns settled? The sources confirmed that 7 cars effectively ceased to exist. They were scattered across the landscape in a smoldering, twisted pile of metal stretching over 200 feet. The immense blast and the subsequent shockwave were so localized and intense that they even took out 2 Rosgvardia troops who were scrambling in the immediate vicinity, a tragic loss that the HUR later dryly referred to as a bonus objective. Crucially, in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, all communications in the sector went dark. The force of the detonation didn't just wreck the train, it literally vaporized the communication lines running alongside the tracks, ensuring that no one could call in reinforcements or assess the full damage immediately. And this is where a 200-foot-long pile of smoldering wreckage instantly became a 20-mile-wide hole in the Russian front line's supply chain. With the rails utterly destroyed and communication severed, the supplies stopped cold. The massive logistical depots at Pskov, which were meant to be feeding the war machine, were instantly rendered irrelevant, transformed into glorified parking lots with nothing flowing in and nothing flowing out. That is a confirmed loss of 500 tons of supplies every week. For the Russian units on the front lines, this translated directly and immediately into less ammunition, less fuel, and less food. This perfect strategic deficit provided the ideal setup for a 20-mile Ukrainian advance without the need to fire a single shot. And Russia's supposed backup plan? To rely on trucks. As military analysts have pointed out, a convoy of slow-moving trucks is not a viable logistical solution. It is merely a deliciously easy target for FPV drones. The Kingpin Gambit stands as a stark lesson in modern warfare. Ukraine achieved a strategic victory not by engaging in expensive frontal combat, but by combining an off-the-shelf $50 jammer, a micro-drone, and the simple exploitation of human arrogance and panic. They proved that intelligence-calculated risk and a deep understanding of physics can prevail over brute force and technological superiority. The result was the total paralysis of a critical logistical artery, a catastrophic failure designed by Ukraine, paid for by Russia. If you think the Ukrainian partisans and intelligence operatives deserve a Nobel Prize for this brilliant strategy, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What supply line do you think they should target next? Thanks for watching.